Hello? Um, Hold on, everybody. It looks like Alan crashed out of StreamYard. Give him a minute to come back. And I'm supposed to be being interviewed by AlanBondar, but his StreamYard crashed right now, so just give him a moment. And then we'll get started with the talk. While we're waiting, what Alan's going to be interviewing me on is my theory on the creation of how I think the creation of Paul's epistles came, how that happened, when it happened, who was responsible, that kind of stuff.
And I'm back. And you all probably met the new host of the Unraveler Show, Jacob Berman. Apparently, it decided to crash on me just randomly in the middle of the opener. So anyway, sorry, folks, but I am back. Yeah, well, welcome to the Unraveler Show. Glad to have you all. Jacob gave the intro, which is awesome. So go ahead and just like right now because you will like it. You will like it. This is going to be a great episode. We're looking forward to hearing all this new information from Jacob about the Apostle Paul and how he was created. It's going to be really cool. Go ahead and subscribe as well. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I would love that. It would help me out a lot as I continue to try to grow the channel and get amazing guests like Jacob on it. So without further ado, Jacob, why don't you go ahead and take it away? This is your show tonight. I'm just here to listen, to learn, and interject thoughts as I think of them.
The consensus of scholars currently, although that's starting to be challenged once again. A while back, it was challenged by Dutch radicals in the 19th and 20th centuries about, that is, do any of the Pauline epistles predate 70 AD? Was there even a historical Paul? Some will go as far as saying Paul didn't exist. I am of the view that Paul did exist, just as I think Jesus did, but that the Pauline epistles, how we get them, is a much more complex story than we've imagined. I really looked into this 5-6 years ago, and originally I believed that Paul's letters were written in the 90s AD. There was a period of a couple of years, basically from 2023 to actually earlier this year, where I set it aside. I kind of doubted it. But after more thought, I realized, no, actually, there was something to it, and there was much more to it than I had previously realized. When you look at references like Epiphanius, actually, I'm kind of skipping ahead. I'll get to Epiphanius in a little bit. There are hints that the church fathers were aware of a problem with the dating of Paul's letters. And they didn't really address it. They would bring it up on occasion, but not too often. One such example comes from Jerome. And Jerome tells us, and Jerome's a 4th century church father, but he records a tradition about an individual called Saul of Giscala. Now, some people will try to dance around this problem and say, Jerome is not claiming that Saul of Giscala preached after 70 AD. And if I just kept reading Jerome, like, okay, I know Jerome says elsewhere that Paul died in AD 66, 68, like under Emperor Nero. Okay, I get the memo. Jerome is presenting a contradiction, though, and he doesn't address it. He does not address the contradiction that Saul of Giscala preached after 70 AD. I'm going to read exactly what Jerome says so there can be no confusion on the matter. And this is what he says. This is on Famous Men 5:5. Paul, formerly called Saul, an apostle outside of a number of the 12 apostles, was of the tribe of Benjamin in the town of Giscala in Judea. When this was taken by the Romans, he removed of his parents to Tarsus in Cilicia, sent by them to Jerusalem to study law. He was educated by Gamaliel, a most learned man whom Luke mentions. Now I'm going to read from his commentary on Philemon. This is what he says. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner of Christ Jesus, greets you. He says, we have received the following story about this Epaphras, Paul's fellow prisoner. They say that the apostle Paul's parents were from the region of Giscala in Judea, and that when the whole province was laid waste by the hands of the Romans, and the Jews were dispersed into the world, they were moved to the city of Tarsus in Cilicia. As a young man, he followed the condition of his parents. If thus what he testifies about himself can be confirmed, are they Hebrews, so am I. Are they Israelites, so am I. Are they Abraham's seed? Are they Abraham's seed? So am I. And again, elsewhere he says Hebrew of Hebrews, and other things indicate that he was a Jew more than a man of Tarsus. But if this is so, then we can conjecture that Epaphras too was arrested at that time when Paul was taken, and that having been found with his own parents in Colossae, a city of Asia, he later received the word about Christ. This is why it is written to the Colossians, as we've said above, Epaphras, who is one of you, a slave of Christ, greets you, being always earnest over you in his prayers. Now, I want to go back to that part where he says, and the Jews were dispersed into the world. Remember that? So I'm like, Jerome, how could you say that? I thought Paul was preaching before 70 AD. And now you're kind of, more than kind of, you're saying that Paul was preaching when the Jews were dispersed into the world. Can't be both, now can it? Now let's integrate other things together, and we're going to start seeing a very big problem, just as I used to see back then. In 1 Corinthians, Paul states that we don't need temples for God. Literally, he says a temple is inside you. Let's not worship God in temples subject to the flames. Now, that's a very bold statement before 70 AD now, isn't it? I believe that's around 1 Corinthians chapter 3, if I remember correctly. It's around there. But I know it's in 1 Corinthians. In 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16, Paul states that the Jews killed Jesus and the prophets, and that the wrath of God has come upon them. Not is going to come upon them, has come upon them. Like in past tense, it's happened. 80, 70's already happened. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute now. That fits in 1 Corinthians, the logic that we see there. Let's not worship God in temples subject to the flames. So that fits what we see in 1 Thessalonians. Now, scholars have noted the problem with 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16. To get around it, some of them will claim it's an interpolation. Unfortunately, there's no manuscript evidence that allows us to remove that and then keep everything else in the letter and assume it's before 70. It's in there, and we're stuck with it. If we use it with 1 Corinthians, it makes sense. But then we have to ask ourselves the question, was he writing in 70 AD or actually decades after 70 AD? How much further into time, how much later into time are we talking about here that these letters were created? If we go to Epiphanius' Penorian now, he talks about Corinthus. He's called a heretic. He was living in the time of the apostles, so Epiphanius basically says. And that Corinthus was stirring up trouble for Paul, Peter, and James. And he even mentions Cornelius. Now, when was that happening? Epiphanius was writing in the 4th century. Let me go back to the 2nd century and mention what Irenaeus of Lyons is saying. Irenaeus says that Corinthus is opposing John. They were coming into an argument with one another when John was in Ephesus. Now, that's a very big problem right there. This is before Epiphanius now, and Irenaeus is saying that Corinthus is in the AD 90s. When was John in Ephesus? In the AD 90s. Because John was expelled to Ephesus. He was living in exile or something to that effect because of the whole Emperor Domitianic persecution showdown. But that happened in the 90s, not in the 50s. If that's when Corinthus was running around, that's when he was a threat to the upcoming what would become later Catholic Orthodoxy. So if Corinthus is living in the 90s and he's facing off of John of Ephesus at a bathhouse, by the way, this is happening at a bathhouse, then as far as Epiphanius is concerned, this would mean that Paul is in the AD 90s. If that happens to fit with what Jerome is saying about Saul of Giscala, preaching after 70 AD. You see my point? So if you piece all that together, there's something very seriously wrong here. But we need to come back to the internal evidence. Because one thing that would be thrown at me in this situation, how could this be the same person that fled from King Aretas in 2 Corinthians 11? A full-grown man in the late AD 30s, 37 AD, fleeing from King Aretas. I've made the point before that King Aretas was going after Paul because Paul was a Herodian. There are Herodian links between the original Paul and Herod Antipas. I'll get to that in a minute. Let's go to Clement. And Clement is going to help sort us out here. What does Clement say? Clement's writing around 96 AD. I agree with the consensus here that Clement was writing around 96 AD. And Clement tells us hardly anything about Paul. And by the way, guess what he also doesn't tell us about? He never mentions the co-authors, Timothy, Silas, Sophanes, and Tertius. Where are the co-authors? Nowhere to be found. It's not in First Clement. It's not even in the Clementine recognitions. A 10-volume book. There's not a single occurrence of those co-authors. At all. They're not there. Now, how the hell does Clement not know about them? But that's really weird. What else does Clement not know about? He never mentions the Gospels, but I'm not going to get too much. I'm not talking about the Gospels in this discussion, but I'm throwing that in there. That Clement is unaware of the New Testament, basically. Now, let's go back to what Clement's saying about Paul. He says, a letter was written by Paul. He just says a letter. One. That's just one letter. That's not evidence of a letter collection by Paul. Where's the 13 letters? Clement doesn't know anything about it. He doesn't. He just says a letter.
Jacob, just a real quick question about that. The context of that, though, does he go on to say anything about that a letter? Because, like, it's possible he's saying a letter was written by Paul where he said blah blah blah, and he's referring to one of his specific letters. So that is a possibility.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't explain any of that.
So there's no context. So he's just literally referring to.
He doesn't even tell us the title of the letter.
Okay, got it.
It's assumed often that it's First Corinthians because what he quotes from it resembles material that we see in First Corinthians, but that's it. It's not very clear, and Clement actually contradicts canonical Paul. He talks about Paul being in bonds 7 times. That's not in the New Testament. The second thing that he says is that Paul made it furthest west of the empire. Well, in Romans 15, he says, I'm going to Spain. But he doesn't state that I made it to Spain. How did Clement know about that? So he's actually contradicting the New Testament. And when I piece that together, that tells me that there was a literary expansion of Paul's letters that happened. There's no way that these 13 letters went back to the original Paul. There's no way. There's no evidence at all that any of these letters before 70 AD. What Clement is describing is contradicting what we have in the New Testament. So the letters need to be moved later in time. And the letters should be better placed in the 90s AD. And so when you look at the references in the epistles, they make more sense. That's why we're being told the temple is gone. Even though it's often believed that Paul's letters don't mention the destruction of the temple. I disagree with that. To me, it clearly does. And the wrath of God is past tense. It's already happened. It's not a prediction. It happened. It's done. But we're talking about the original Paul. And the original Paul was in the AD 30s. That's when Clement, in the recognitions, is placing the original Paul. And the Paul that's in 1 Clement is heavily suggested to have lived and died way before Clement wrote that letter. Now, when did he die? By comparing 1 Clement to Josephus, here's what I pieced together. After Paul attacked James, because Clement says that Paul attacked James in the recognitions. Paul attacked James. James does survive the attack, but we're told in another source, Pseudo-Dorotheus quotes Abdius of Babylon on this, that another person with a Fuller's Club brained James, the brother of Jesus. So this is a very violent attack, and Paul is involved and complicit in the murder of James, the brother of Jesus. This is happening in 36 AD. This whole thing's happening in 36 AD. This is almost 30 years before the James that Josephus mentioned was killed. I don't think it's the same James, because you can't die twice. I do think Josephus wrote the James passage. I think it's authentic, but I don't think it's the same guy. There's a problem. I have made the suggestion before, and I'll make it here, that in the apocalypses of James, we're being given an indicator that the James in Josephus was the son of Theudas and was referred to as the spiritual brother of Jesus. So in other words, after the original James was killed, brother of Jesus became a title. Brother of the Lord, brother of Jesus. So later on, when other people taking up the mantle of James under the name James, or just happen to have his name, they could be referred to that way. And if you look at the epistle of James, for instance, in the New Testament, James is writing a letter, and he's not claiming to be Jesus' brother, but in James 5:6, he gives a hint, a nod back to the original James when he says, "You killed the just one who did not resist you." Isn't that interesting? So in the James tradition, they talk about this guy being killed who did not resist. And Robert Eisenman made a comparison with Stephen and Acts with the James and the recognitions, because Saul approved of Stephen's death, just like he does in the recognitions. So Acts is giving the role to Stephen, the role that was originally James's, if you get my point. Now, what was happening in the 90s? Who was the Paul, or the would-be Paul? Paul the wannabe, if you want to put it that way. Because this is not Paul. This is somebody else. He's claiming to be Paul. Saul of Giscala took upon himself the mantle of Paul. He's the one that was facing off against Corinthus, along with others that were opposing him. This is all happening in the 90s. The co-authors, Sophanes, Tertius, Silas, and Timothy, they were collaborating with this Saul in the 90s. And they were assembling the material together. They were creating an elaboration, a large elaboration, a massive literary expansion of the works of the original Paul, because they needed to rehabilitate Paul to meet the needs of the very young, recently started, the recent church had recently begun at that time. They needed to rehabilitate Paul, change Paul's theology, update his theology to represent their needs. And the other thing is Emperor Domitian. Let's bring Domitian into the discussion. Domitian persecuted the Christians and philosophers. It's a massive persecution. Well, let me correct myself there a little bit. The philosophers faced a massive persecution, not so much the Christians. It was the Christian aspect of it was more of a minor persecution. But what happened is in 96 AD, there was an individual called Stephen who killed Domitian. Well, they actually stabbed each other to death, so they killed each other. If you go to 1 Corinthians, what do we see? The household of Stephanos. Paul says, greetings to the household of Stephanos. That's interesting. If we go to 2 Thessalonians, which is, by the way, frequently dated to the AD 90s by the consensus. That's the interesting thing. Before I continue, I want to note the consensus of scholars already agree that at least half the letters in the New Testament, just about half, attributed to Paul, were written in the 90s or later. That's the interesting thing, because if you look at 2 Thessalonians, you have this individual called the man of lawlessness who claims to be a deity. And that's what we see of Emperor Domitian. He calls himself Lord and God. He deifies himself while he's still alive. That was very taboo in the Roman Empire. Emperor Caligula did basically the same thing in the late AD 30s. And he was later assassinated, just like Domitian was. Caligula was reigning about late AD 30s, I think early 40s. But anyway. So basically, that's what Caligula was doing in the late 30s. Domitian does the same thing in the 90s, and they both get assassinated in their respective time periods. Domitian also had Epaphroditus executed, by the way, in 95 AD. And after that, Titus Flavius Clemens was executed in AD 96. He had Epaphroditus killed because he accused Epaphroditus of being involved with Emperor Nero's death, which is very strange because Nero's been dead for like 30 years. So why does he suddenly care about it now? Domitian's been in control of the empire for a while now, since like 81 AD, after Titus Flavius Vespasianus Jr., because Titus Flavius Vespasian, his father, they had the same name. So Domitian had Epaphroditus and he had Clement killed. If you go to Philippians, when Paul states greetings to the household of Caesar, he mentions a Clement and an Epaphroditus. They're in there. So when you piece all that together, on top of the fact you have 2 Thessalonians complaining about a man of lawlessness who strongly resembles Domitian, and scholars have also compared him to Emperor Caligula because the son of lawlessness actually resembles both of them. And there have been arguments for either or, and I get that. I think for the most part, it's about Domitian. It may have taken some cues from Caligula in the way it describes the son of lawlessness, but man of lawlessness, but still. And again, this is all in the 90s. So we got an Epaphroditus and we got a Clemens in the 90s. We got a Stephen in the 90s. We got a Corinthus in the 90s. We got John of Ephesus in the 90s. Seeing a pattern here. And we got James, someone that Paul was opposing, also in the 90s. The Epistle of James was written in the 90s. And it makes a lot of counterpoints to what we see in Galatians. Because the Epistle of James was trying to integrate being faithful to the Torah within Christianity. It was more closer to Judaism than Galatians was. Galatians was like, we can just forget about circumcision. We don't need it. And it's distancing itself from Torah orthodoxy. But in the Epistle of James, it's kind of bringing that orthodoxy back in to a degree. One of the pieces of evidence that's often held to be evidence for the AD 50s is the Erastus inscription. I might actually pull that up on the screen just real quick so everybody can see what that looks like. Give me a second. Let me download a good copy of that image, and then everybody can take a look at it.
Well, while you're downloading that, let me ask you a question. I don't know if you can do two things at once. I wouldn't be able to, but hopefully you can.
I got it.
Oh, you got it? Never mind. I'll wait.
Yeah.
Go ahead. We'll add it to the stage.
So originally, this inscription was dated to the mid-1st century. And as you can imagine, this excited some scholars because, like, oh, we got archaeological evidence confirming that Paul wrote in the 50s. This is amazing. Well, not so much, because an archaeologist went back there and redated it and realized, no, this was written under Hadrian. And let me see if I can get the name of the individual that redated it. I'm
just going to pop this large screen for a second so people can get a better look. Although it didn't actually go large screen, it just centered it. Never mind.
Oh, no, it's fine. All right, let me see here. Yeah, I can't find the particular person's name that I'm looking for, but John Kloppenborg does talk about this in his book Christ Associations, that the Erastus inscription came from the Hadrianic period. And I did an interview with John Kloppenborg. I think it was about 3 years ago. And we discussed this on the channel, and I've also had discussions about this with Marcus Vincent as well. Marcus Vincent discusses this in his forthcoming, the English version of his book, From Saul to Paul. I'm sorry, From Paul to Saul. That's what it's called, From Paul to Saul. So when I pieced all that together, that archaeological evidence, that's gone. That's done away with. There's scholarly acknowledgement. Okay, this is not evidence for an 80s, 50s Paul. We got to move this later. I just want to get all that evidence out there for the audience to see. And when you start putting it together, we got Paul in the 30s. We got another one claiming to be him, at least in the 90s, working with co-authors. And there's no evidence that the original Paul knew any of the co-authors. And let's think about this logically. The Saul of Giscala, after 70 AD and active in the 90s AD, had way more connections than the original Paul did, politically and all kinds of stuff. He had a lot of resources. Josephus doesn't talk about Paul because the original Paul wasn't famous. He was not widely connected. If the emergence of the Pauline revolution, if we want to call it that, happened after Josephus or shortly after Josephus, no wonder why Josephus never discussed it. He mentions a Jesus. He mentions a James that's supposedly Jesus' brother. He talks about John the Baptist, but he never talks about Paul. Where the hell is Paul and Josephus? He's not there. Well, I'll tell you what we do have instead. And this is the interesting thing. Because we have to ask ourselves this question: where did the idea that Paul was killed by Nero come from? Because people say, well, Jacob, we know that Paul died under Nero, right? We know that, right? Everybody talks about it. Well, we got a problem with that. Why don't we pull up this slide? I'm going to bring this one up. I'm going to share screen. You should be able to see it.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so let's read from this. This is from The Wars of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. After this calamity had befallen Cestius, many of the most eminent of the Jews swam away from the city, as from a ship when it was going to sink. Notice the metaphor there, sinking ship. Casavarus, therefore, and Saul, who were brethren, together with Philip, the son of Jasimus, who was the commander of King Agrippa's forces, ran away from the city and went to Cestius. But then how Antipas, who had been besieged with them in the king's palace, but would not fly away with them, was afterwards slain by the seditious, we shall relate hereafter. However, Cestius sent Saul and his friends, at their own desire, to Achaia, to Nero, to inform him of the great distress they were in, and to lay the blame of their kindling the war upon Florus, as hoping to alleviate his own danger by provoking his indignation against Florus. So, Alan, you notice that there? Trying to blame the war on Florus to alleviate danger. And they're being sent before Nero. You can start to see where they're getting the idea from that Paul was killed by the hands of Nero. Let's read the next passage real quick, and then we'll discuss.
Before we do, though, it's also interesting he refers to him as Saul instead of Paul.
Yes. In the meantime, the people of Damascus, when they were informed of the destruction of the Romans, set about the slaughter of those Jews that were among them. And as they had them already cooped up together in the place of public exercises, which they had done out of the suspicion they had of them, they thought they should meet with no difficulty in the attempt. Yet did they distrust their own wives, which were almost all of them addicted to the Jewish religion, on which account it was that their greatest concern was how they might conceal these things from them. So they came upon the Jews and cut their throats, as being in a narrow place in number 10,000, and all of them unarmed. This in 1 hour's time without anybody to disturb them. You can take that off now.
Okay.
All right, so we got another Saul that's living in between, right in the middle between the original Paul's death in the 30s and the other one that's responsible for canonical Paul, the 13-letter collection in the New Testament, and the one that collaborated with those co-authors. This particular Saul, notice that there's a lot missing here, was never a Christian. We have no reason to believe that this man had anything to do with Jesus at all. These are all being imposed on this guy by early Christians that were reading Josephus. What's the first document that talks about Paul's death under Nero? Well, the first concrete document, some may argue that there might be a little bit of evidence of it being slightly earlier, but the Acts of Paul, a late 2nd century document, the Acts of Paul, or the Acts of Paul Thecla, which is also part of it, talks about Paul being beheaded under Emperor Nero in the year 66, basically in the year 66 AD. Because what happened in Josephus is that the Saul there was killed in 66 AD. Notice it didn't happen in Rome. It happened in Achaia, different location, still by the command of Nero. So what happened is, I surmised that even before the Acts of Paul was created, details of even the one I just mentioned to you before was being conflated with the Paul that lived in the 30s, creating the Paul we see in the letters. Let me give some evidence for this. In 2 Corinthians, we got a weird situation where Paul gets into free shipwrecks. Free shipwrecks? I know shipwrecks were common in the ancient world. I get that. I'm not dismissing this. But the same guy got into free shipwrecks? That's a little unlikely, don't you think? Not to mention the fact that Josephus used the shipwreck as a metaphor to talk about what was happening in Judea, as we just went over that a minute ago. And then in the very next paragraph, it talked about chaos happening in Damascus. In both 2 Corinthians and in Acts, we get a discussion about Paul fleeing from Damascus, but two very different versions of the story. By the way, they're 30 years apart, just so we're clear. Acts contradicts the chronology of 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians has it happening in 37 AD. Acts has it happening in either, depending on how we interpret it, the 50s, so 20 years apart, or 60s, 30 years later. Okay. In Acts, Paul flees from Jews that are coming after him in Damascus. But in 2 Corinthians, he's fleeing from Arabs. Yeah, I don't think that happened to the same guy twice. You see the point here? So we're starting to piece together, we're seeing the same thing happening to Paul over and over and over again in different ways. The exact same thing.
Stories being updated to match the audience.
Yeah, if we believe this is all coherently the same guy, We have to believe this is repetitive in Paul's life over and over and over and over again. But that doesn't make sense. Not to mention another glaring problem. The book of Acts never mentions Paul's letters. Ever. Talks about the letter of James. I believe that's in Acts 15. So it knows about the epistle of James in the New Testament, so it should know about the canonical epistles of Paul. But it doesn't mention it. That's really strange. Acts doesn't talk about Paul's death when it should have. Well, you can't talk about the same guy that died in 3 different ways now, can you? I think Acts is written late enough where the author knew there was a problem. There were different versions of Paul's letters in circulation. Even 2 Thessalonians complains about letters being written in Paul's name, which is ironic. And by the way, when it says that, it says, do not read a letter as if it came from us, plural, not one, us. Isn't that interesting? We got to remember that 1st, 2nd Thessalonians are co-authored. Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they're both written by 3 different guys. I think that's the biggest reason why the 2 letters contradict each other significantly on eschatology. Scholars talk about how 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians don't agree with each other, so it can't be by Paul. They'll just say 1 Thessalonians is by Paul, and 2 Thessalonians is not. But the way I look at it is co-authors contributed to one letter more than the other. I think that's what's going on here. We have 5 letters that are not co-authored, only 5. Galatians, Ephesians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus. Those are the only 5 letters attributed to Paul, not claiming to be multi-authored. All the other 8 letters, they're multi-authored, including Romans, because the co-author is mentioned in Romans 16.
Was Philemon? I can't remember.
Yes, Paul and Timothy.
Paul and Timothy, okay.
Yes. So was Philippians, Paul and Timothy.
Yeah, I remember Philippians. It's Philemon.
No. Was Saul of Giscala martyred? I kind of went back and forth on this. I was like, maybe he was killed by Corinthus' men. But I changed my mind recently. Because in the pastoral epistles, which I think were written, they were probably written, I think they were written in 97 AD. I'll tell you why. In 97 AD, Paul says, okay, I'm skipping a couple of steps. Let me go back to Domitian's death and what happened afterwards. Then it'll make sense. After Domitian was assassinated, Emperor Nerva came into the picture. He released the philosophers and the Christians that were imprisoned by Emperor Domitian. This would have included Paul. And when you look at what's going on in 97, and you compare that to the pastoral epistles, you compare that to Philippians and Philemon, it makes sense. In Philippians and Philemon, we're getting the picture that Epaphras is coming to go see Paul in his bonds. And Paul says, I'm going to be released soon. And then, in the pastoral epistles in 2 Timothy, Paul states that he gives thanks to Onesiphorus for visiting him while he was in chains. I'm like, wait a minute. We got a problem. I'm supposed to believe the pastorals are written right before Nero kills him. That's the typical view, and at least that's the standard Christian view. That's not what they're saying. It's the opposite. Paul got released from Roman custody. Well, in what period of the 1st century does that make any sense? See where I'm going with this? It makes sense in 96 AD when Nerva came into power, and he released those people. This is like 30 years later in time. This is not in Nero. This doesn't make sense under Nero. It makes sense under Nerva. And then it's after Nerva does this. That's when we get Corinthus coming into the picture. That's when we get the whole Ephesian incident at the bathhouse in the picture. Everything else I was talking about earlier comes into the picture. And we get a timeline, a coherent timeline that makes sense. So under Nerva, Paul was released. John and Corinthus are getting into a conflict with each other. So is Paul and Corinthus. We got Cornelius living in the 90s. There's another one. Pliny the Younger. He writes to Emperor Trajan. Trajan comes into power after Nerva's death. And what does Trajan say? Trajan says, Trajan and Pliny, they communicate to each other, and they are talking about Flavius Archippus. Flavius Archippus is just like the Archippus we see in the canonical epistles. And it's interesting that Paul tells Archippus to return to work in the Lord. Now, let me read that exact verse where that is. I believe that's in Colossians, but let me pull that up to make sure that I'm not misremembering where it is. Oh, here we go. Colossians 4:17. Tell Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you have been given in the Lord. See that you fulfill it. Was there something that happened that disrupted it? Because you don't say something like that unless there was a problem with him fulfilling it, right? So what was the problem? Oh, he was imprisoned. And so we have a Flavius Archippus in a later period of time that is in Roman custody at some point, or he had issues with the Romans. And that's what Paul was talking about. Or Saul of Giscala, who's calling himself Paul, was talking about. And in 2 Thessalonians, that makes sense now, but let's assemble all this together. The way that I think that Saul of Giscala is going after the original Paul. He's saying, don't read a letter as if it were from us that says something different than from what we say. The reason he's saying that is because, well, I should say they, because this is a project of a committee, multiple co-authors. They are saying that because they are rewriting, they are reimagining the original Paul. So let me lay out a timeline of the three deaths, when these three deaths happened, how they died in different ways, right? Let me lay it down. After James died, and the original James, the real brother of Jesus, not the other one that was calling himself the brother of Jesus in 62 AD, the real one in 36 AD. It's a bit after that we get a mention of Herod Antipas being removed from power and being expelled to Spain. Josephus tells us about this in the Jewish Wars. And Herod Antipas died in 39 AD. That's exactly what Clement says where Paul went. He went furthest west of the empire. That's Spain, Hispania. So Paul went to Spain with his relative, Herod Antipas. He was working for Herod. He was also working for the high priest, because the high priest sent Paul to go after James. Just kind of like what happened to the much later one in the 60s, but Ananus had him stoned to death. It was a very different. The method, the way he was killed was completely different. It can't be the same James. It doesn't make sense. So after Herod Antipas died, Paul wouldn't have had protection anymore. Because Herod Antipas was disliked because of his mismanagement of the tetrarchy, the Herodian tetrarchy. He was removed from power. His removal from power didn't come long after Pilate and the prefect and Caiaphas, the high priest, were also themselves removed from power. That's not a coincidence. So they're getting rid of these authorities and replacing them with people that the Romans thought would be better for the region. Now, when does that tell me that Paul died? I think 39 AD. And I'll tell you why I think that happened. Clement tells us that envious believers went after Paul. Let me bring that up. Don't pull it up on the screen yet. Okay, I'm ready for you to bring it up on the screen now. Okay, I'm going to read from this and we'll discuss. There was Peter, who by reason of unrighteous jealousy endured not one, but many labors, and thus having borne his testimony, went to his appointed place of glory. So he died just before Paul did. By reason of jealousy and strife, Paul, by his example, pointed out the prize of patient endurance. And after he had been 7 times in bonds, I talked about that earlier, had been driven into exile, had been stoned, and had preached in the east and in the west, he won the noble renown, which was the reward of his faith. Having taught righteousness unto the whole world, and having reached the furthest bounds of the west, I was just talking about that a moment ago. And when he had borne his testimony before the rulers, so he departed from the world and went unto the holy place, having been found a notable pattern of patient endurance. This is about Paul being killed by other believers, literally. Oscar Coleman, I think he was writing in the 1930s. He noticed this. He said other Christians appear to be responsible for killing Paul, or at least he called them other Christians. To me, it looks like other Jews were responsible for killing him. It may or may not have been related to James's death, and even if it was other Christians, just like Paul, regardless, he died a violent death. And I think this would have been in 39 AD, after Antipas had met his end. Paul wouldn't have had protection. He was vulnerable because Paul was involved in violent activities. Like the original Paul was way more violent than the picture we're being given. If we look at these other texts. And so when did the second one die? The middleman, Saul or Saulus, and his brother Christobaros. AD 66. I talked about that earlier. They were executed by Emperor Nero because Nero was obviously pissed off at their activities and what they were doing. Josephus even called Saul a wicked man, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. I did not mention that earlier. Josephus called him a wicked man. I don't have that passage in front of me. He says this somewhere else in this text.
Okay.
But the third one, it looks like the third one died. At one time, I thought, okay, probably a violent death. But the more I think about it, the way he complains about his age, he kind of hints at this. I believe that's in the Pastoral epistles where he feels like he's tired of it. He doesn't want to do this anymore. You're kind of getting hints of this. I think after the whole Corinthus incident, which would have been about 97 AD, I think he died. Probably of natural causes. I don't think he was martyred. I don't think he was killed. There's no evidence that he was actually killed. And there's no evidence of his activity after 97 AD where he's gone. So you have 2 that die violent deaths, and the third one died a non-violent death. He died of natural causes. And so when you piece all that together, why were they conflated into the same person? I think that's the final question. Why the conflation? Why did that happen? Well, really, I think what was, like I said earlier, they needed to rehabilitate the original Paul for the needs of the church in the 90s. And I also think that Saul and his co-authors were plagiarizing Josephus. I was kind of hinting that this was happening earlier. We actually see this evidence in 2 Corinthians 11 because there he slips. He says that Paul fled from Damascus. Well, that doesn't make sense because Aretas never took over Damascus. So how the hell do you flee from it? King Aretas III, 100 years earlier than King Aretas IV, he did control Damascus. So that doesn't make sense. I'll tell you what I think happened. He was reading about the Saul and Josephus. And during the conflation process, He made a mistake. He thought Saul fled from Damascus when he didn't. He fled from Judea. The original Paul in 37 AD would have fled from Herodium in Judea, not in Damascus. So you see my point? So during the whole conflation process, he made a mishap. He made a mistake and misremembered that Paul fled from Damascus. If the genuine Paul the Apostle, if the original Paul was responsible for the situation, he would not have made a mistake like this. Errors like this make more sense when it comes to somebody forging, expanding, fabricating data. You see what I'm trying to say? So when you get to Acts never talks about Paul's death because you got the original one that died a completely different way in 39. And Clement, he's more honest about it. He'll tell us that he got killed by envious believers. They're not going to want to claim other believers killed Paul. They'd rather blame it on the Romans. But you can't. You see my point? You can't even blame the third Paul's death at the hands of the Romans. The second one you can, but he was not a believer. So the author of Acts was stuck. You can't make it work. So you don't. What do you do when you're stuck like that? You don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. It's unresolvable in the mind of the author of Acts. That's what I think happened. The Acts of Paul, which is bringing us the story of Paul's death under Nero, it's basically suggesting after his death, by the way, that he was alive again. It says something like that. It's very strange. I'm like, if that's what that sounds like, and I think it's what it sounds like to me, am I going to believe his head got reattached? I was laughing when I first realized, I'm like, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. I'm like, and it's to me, I think part of it wasn't just to make Paul look like Jesus, by the way, but the other part of it was to harmonize the different deaths of Paul. Oh, well, if it's the same guy and he rose from the dead, no big deal. He can die again later and write the letters later too, before he dies again. It's just nonsense. No, that's desperation. And then when you got the fact that the epistles seem to be aware already of forging in Paul's name, when you read 2 Thessalonians, that's just more evidence. The person that put together the 13 letters of the New Testament, along with these co-authors, they're not working with the original Paul. We are not being given these letters from the original Paul. They don't come from him. And Clement only mentions one letter. So in the 30s, we got one letter. And Clement, by the way, links a gospel to that Paul too, by the way. I'm not going to get too much into that here, but in the future, when I talk about that more, we could probably have another discussion like this again, in which I dive into the original Paul's gospel much more, because it's actually pretty interesting, but I'm not going to do that here right now. And then in the 90s, we get the 13 letters. And then in the 140s AD, we get the Marcionite collection, a 10-letter abridged collection. Now, there are scholars like Marcus Vincent who believe that the Marcionite edition actually came first before the canonical edition. I don't currently believe that, but either way, Paul, the original Paul, didn't write the letters from either collection. And Marcus also doesn't think that Paul wrote any of the letters in either collection. And so then the question would be, can we recover what the original Paul wrote? Well, I take 1 Clement seriously, so I think it's possible to recover a little bit of what he probably wrote, but it's not much. It's very small. It's very small. So that's what's going.
That's some really good work there. So the second Saul / Paul also wouldn't have been the writer of the letters either.
Oh, he didn't contribute in the slightest. He
Um,
wasn't. He got this. Just so I can explain, he got plagiarized and then integrated into the story post mortem. During his life, he had nothing to do with any of this. But continue.
and that's the one Josephus actually references.
Yeah, that's the one he talks about.
Now, just so you're, if anybody is looking for it, I was able to nail it down. What Jacob was saying, that he's called a wicked man. From what I can tell, there isn't actually a reference where Josephus singles Saul out directly as a wicked man solo, but his association with the Jerusalem leaders, um, and all of his compadres that were part of um, the leadership there. He refers to them and criticizes them as for their wickedness, treachery, opportunism, and so forth. So he associates them all together. So by default, Paul would be considered a wicked man. But
precisely, that's.
But if anybody's looking for that, there wasn't any specific reference, but he does actually reference him along with the rest of them as a group. So there is that. Another thing I wanted to say that I thought was really interesting, because it never occurred to me until today to even think about this, but to strengthen your argument even more for what you're saying, it is odd, don't you think, that Josephus never even uses the word Christian in any of his writings? He never once refers back to Christians. He refers to people that we claim are Christians, like, James, the brother of Jesus, but no reference to the word Christians. But they were first called Christians at Antioch, according to Acts, right? So if they were already called Christians and Christianity had spread, why isn't Josephus just using that name to refer to all these people who were, going through whatever they're going through? So that, that what you're arguing has major ramifications on even the start of Christianity. I find this very interesting that Josephus never uses it once.
Well, the testimonium, and then again, that it depends on what one thinks about it, because I'm at present convinced that Josephus did write the testimonium. But even then, Josephus's reference there is in line with Pliny the Younger, because Pliny says that about 20 years ago from his time, which would have been early 90s, about 92 AD or somewhere around there, we start seeing the emergence of Christians, or Christians reach their peak. Well, that's about when Josephus starts to bring it into the picture. But again, where the hell is Paul? We're still not being told about him.
Right, but even in the testimonium, what I'm saying is he doesn't use the word.
Right.
Just your reference is James. So it's just an oddity.
Actually, let me see here.
And we do have at least one super chat. I see one right now. And I want to make sure we ask that before we forget or get off the show. And by the way, it feels like Jacob's made his case here. It's very strong. I love what you've said here. Again, it's got great ramifications for our view of when Christianity began.
Before you continue, what Josephus does say, and it's weird how he uses the word Christians in the testimonium. He called them the tribe, and the tribe of the Christians. And tribe is a very weird way of putting it, because I'm like, well, if they were a major organization, why would he call them that? A tribe? So again, what Pliny means by peak is still not like a major organization has expanded everywhere. It's not what Pliny means by that. It can't be. But continue, Alan.
No, and that's good. So I didn't have much more to say other than this was very enlightening. And I wanted to let everybody know this is a good chance for you to start throwing in your questions, especially your super chats. Those will come first. And I want to make sure we have a chance to answer some of those. But Jacob, before we do, is there anything else you wanted to say to wrap it up in a nice bow before we turn over to questions?
I suppose I could reiterate my conclusion that it's not like there were literally 3 different Pauls, and one could put it that way. And I have in the past as kind of a joke, but that's not literally what I mean. It's what's happening is there's imitations of Josephus happening in the letters. Now, there is a pseudo historical theory going around right now So some nonsense on the internet about Josephus being Paul, and it's ridiculous. No, that is. Some people might try to integrate what I'm saying to fit that nonsense when it doesn't. That it is impossible. They cannot possibly be the same person. Josephus had nothing to do with any of this. He had nothing to do with this. But what's happening is you have the authors of the letters imitating Josephus. For instance, when Josephus talks about that he spent 3 years of a guy called Bannus, and then he decided to be a Pharisee. That's from the year 53 to 56 AD. Then 14 years later, Josephus goes to Jerusalem with Commander Titus. Well, in Galatians, that's kind of what Paul did. He spent 3 years with Barnabas, and then 14 years later, he goes to Jerusalem with Titus. That's pretty interesting. And then you have 2 Corinthians, his obsession with shipwrecks, free shipwrecks. You got a flight from Damascus. You got Paul claiming to have a vision. He's ascending into like the third level of heaven in 2 Corinthians. And Josephus, he claimed to have seen Roman troops running around the clouds during the siege of Jerusalem in 70, which also has similarities to the little apocalypse in the Gospel of Mark and in the other Gospels, except John, because John doesn't have that. But you see my point. So there are similarities. Now, I'm not claiming that Barnabas is Bannus. No, the Clementine recognitions mentions a Barnabas in the 30s that looks nothing like the guy in Josephus. What happened is he got rewritten with details of the Bannus in Josephus, so he became similar due to changes to his story by later authors. So that's what happened. So that's what Galatians did. It changed how Barnabas was described in relation to this whole situation, and that's how he became similar to the Bannus and Josephus. And the three Pauls, they were the original Paul and the other and the other two, they were amalgamated in Acts for simplicity. Because you have a problem is you can't have, you gotta pick one. You gotta decide which one of them is gonna be the main guy, the main anchor of the story. Well, they picked Saul to center the chronology around. Notice that Saul, the one that was killed in 66 AD along with his brother Kosavarus, he's in the middle. He's the bridge between the two chronologically. You see my point? Like he's in between the other two guys, the original Paul and Saul of Giscala. So Saul, who was, by the way, he was also a Herodian. I didn't mention that earlier, but the Saul and Josephus was also a Herodian, like the first one was. So they were merged together and at the halfway point, the middle point, with the Saul that Josephus was mentioning. So it was kind of like bridging the gulf between the two conflicting chronologies. It's like, okay, we're not going to go off entirely with the guy in the 30s. We're not going to go entirely with the guy in the 90s. So we're gonna put him in the 60s, and then later on, the Acts of Paul tries to work out his death, a post New Testament text, and suggests that he was alive again after Nero supposedly had him killed, and that way he could die again later. So these are post New Testament harmonizations in an attempt to bridge the gulf between these various individuals, and that's pretty much it.
Wow, man, this was really enlightening. So thank you, Jacob. The world loves when you think, and I enjoy listening to you. It's like just gold coming out of your mouth, and I greatly appreciate you joining me here tonight and sharing all this. I want to go to some questions now, and
Sure.
If anybody would like to throw some in, I'll scroll down as we go. But we're going to start with Daniel Kyle, $5 super chat, asks, would the second Paul, and I'm not sure, maybe he means the third at this point, but you'll know, would the second Paul be the actual missionary trained by Simon Magus, the first Paul, and possibly Marcion? Could the missionary journeys be Marcion's?
Well, that would require me to believe that Simon Magus was Paul. Now, Bob Price does think that Simon Magus was Paul before they were balkanized into two separate characters. I disagree with this. The problem with this view is that the Clementine recognitions actually does mention the first Paul on one occasion. And that under Caiaphas, the high priest, and Gamaliel, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, Nasi is Hebrew for president. So president of the Sanhedrin, Gamaliel. And that reminds me, I need to mention the other Gamaliel, but I'll do that in a moment. But just to deal with this first, this Saul would have been in the 30s at the same time as Simon Magus was in. Simon Magus was also in the 30s. The recognitions puts both of them in the 30s. It distinguishes the two as separate people. I don't see how they could be the same. The missionary journeys, well, there wasn't as many. Like when I look at Clement doesn't say a lot about Paul's original missionary journeys. He says very little. And then I could also mention that actually there's a strange reference by Clement of Alexandria. I didn't even mention this earlier, that makes Paul and Marcion contemporaries. He actually says that in the Stramata. In fact, here's what I'm going to do. Alan, I'm going to have you pull up an image in a second so everybody can go see it.
Okay.
There it is. I don't know if it's going to appear on the screen right. Oh, actually, that works pretty well. This is what Clement says. Likewise, they allege that Valentinus was a hero of Theudas, and he was the pupil of Paul, for Marcion, who arose in the same age with them, lived as an old man with the younger heretics, and after him Simon heard for a little the preaching of Peter. Now, just how in the hell that is Paul and Marcion contemporaries? That's weird. That can't be the original Paul. No way. He's been dead for a long time, 39 AD. But Marcion's believed to have been born in the late 1st century, somewhere between 80 and like 95 AD, somewhere around that time period, perhaps slightly later. But I think more like 85 to 90 makes more sense. Well, if he met Paul, well, I really mean to say Saul of Giscala, in the 90s, the one that's responsible for, with the other members of his little committee, his group of co-authors creating the canonical Pauline text, Marcion could have known him. You see my point? Marcion could have known him, and that's what Clement, I think, is talking about here. To finish addressing the super chat, could you pull it up back on the screen, the super chat for me?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks. I think Paul's missionary journeys were heavily elaborated in canonical Paul. Now, I'm not against that. The idea that Simon Magus was being like plagiarized and integrated. I'll give an example because we're seeing this in this very situation, this very discussion tonight. You know how someone could make a Hollywood movie and it's like, okay, they have one actor playing a character, but they have another actor playing that same character in the next movie. See my point? That's sort of how I look at Paul, but it's not a perfect analogy because it has to do with Paul being adopted as like a spiritual identity in a way. Wherever later Saul is claiming to be Paul. Well, you have different people taking on Paul on the mantles of themselves, previous individuals with the same or similar names. You see that with James in the epistle. He knows he's not James, the brother of Jesus. He's not going to even claim to be James, the brother of Jesus. But he will say that you've killed the righteous one who did not resist you in James 5:6, and that's a reference back to the original James's death. And in the same way that when you see in 2 Thessalonians, Saul of Giscala is trying to use his authority along with the authority of his co-authors to say, we dismiss other letters of Paul that are not from us. And it's almost like you could compare it to a legal situation, like where different people working on the same Hollywood movie are having legal fights with each other because, like, no, you stole my ideas for the movie, or this is not the way I wanted it to be. You know what I'm trying to say? So it's kind of like that in a way. again, probably not a perfect analogy, but you get my point. Simon Magus, yeah, his fighting with Peter is often compared to Paul's conflict with Peter. There are similarities. But we have to remember that Clement also talks about a Cephas or Peter that was in opposition to the original Paul in the 30s. Now, I think that one was the same one that was opposing Simon Magus. Now, the claim is that Marcion is said to have known Simon Magus personally. I don't have that relevant information in front of me right now, so that's not something I can address right now. But what I can say is we have to be careful with what they mean by Marcion being connected to Simon Magus. What do they mean by that? Did they really meet? Is it somebody else claiming to be Simon Magus? Because we also have to be open to the possibility of pseudo Simon Maguses. Yeah, just like there are pseudo Pauls. Because the recognitions unmistakably put Simon Magus in the 30s. There's no escaping from it. It's very clear. Simon Magus is placed really early. And so the question is, if Clement of Alexandria, he does admit that Marcion was like an old guy in the 2nd century. So well, just how old was Marcion? Could he have been born earlier in time than we thought? But that's something I would have to look into further. And the other thing is, Simon Magus, like some other individual, may have been called Simon Magus later, and that's what I mean. That's why we have to be careful with that. We have to be very careful with that. Marcion is typically understood to be a successor of Serdo or Curdon, but Gnostic. And there seems to be links. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick. This has to do with Marcion's predecessor. Yeah, it is Curdo or Curdon, but Gnostic. So Curdon's his predecessor. If Curdon was his predecessor, then was Curdon's predecessor and the predecessor to that predecessor? Which one of them which one knew Simon Magus? That's kind of what I mean. If that's something that I will explore later, but not in this discussion. But thank you for the question, Daniel.
Yeah, well, thank you for your answer. Jacob, there's one other question here, but I have a question of my own. Do you still think, and it's a 2-part question, do you still think Galatians would have been the first letter written? And if so, what's the date you give to that letter?
Oh, I've not said, I don't think I've said Galatians was the first letter. And the Marcion,
it's typically the first letter, and so I shouldn't have phrased it that way. I should have just asked, do you think it's the first letter? Because that's typically the...
No, I think it was written... It seems like it was written in 97 AD to me, just after... just not long after Paul's imprisonment ended in 96 AD. The pastoral epistles seem to be... They seem to be before Galatians. When Paul thanks Onesiphorus for seeing him in his chain. But one could take the interpretation that they're shortly after Galatians, especially when Paul complains about... let me see if I can find that verse. I think it's in 2 Timothy. Yeah, it's in 2 Timothy 4:6-8, where he says, I'll read it real quick. As for me, I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. From now on, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. And so what I think happened was, the more I think about it, I think the most likely case is, regardless of which one of those letters was written before the other, Paul was tired of it. He felt like he was dying. And in Galatians, we see Paul's mad that all of his work is being undone in Galatia. He talks about, he laments that, look at all the work I've done in the past, while ironically plagiarizing Josephus at the same time. Again, I'm talking about Salavascala, not the original Paul, the third guy in the 90s.
Right.
And he's saying that his work is being undone. He calls them fools, and he laments what they're doing. They seem to be, in his mind, they are regressing to Torah orthodoxy, and it's pissing him off.
Right.
But Timothy died in 96 AD, by the way. There's a 4th century document called the Acts of Timothy. I didn't even mention that yet. And this is why I suspect the pastorals were written before Galatians, because Timothy died in Ephesus at about the end of Domitian's reign, when he was trying to interrupt their worship practices. And they killed him. But the Acts of Timothy is putting Timothy's death in the 90s. That's one of Paul's co-authors. In the 90s. Again. So you see what I'm talking about? When you look at these texts, there's evidence that they're being placed later in time. Timothy dying in the 90s and writing with Paul in the 50s. That doesn't make any sense. If we adjust the dating of the letters in the 90s, that makes sense. Makes sense to me.
So either way, regardless of which was first, you're thinking like 70s.
70s. What? I'm sorry.
The first, the letters, when it was written.
The very first letter.
Yeah.
Well, the first letter that Clement talks about, a letter of Paul, that would have been the 30s, and we don't have it.
Okay, but the ones we do have.
The ones we have, I think, were in the 90s. All of them.
Okay, so 90s. I mean, sorry.
All of them. No, you're fine.
Jerusalem on the brain.
Yeah.
90s. Yeah. So all right. So either way, that's the earliest.
Yeah, that's the earliest. And I think that since Timothy seemed to die before the whole Corinthus incident in 97 at Ephesus, it makes better sense to me that the pastorals were written to First and Second Timothy were written to Timothy. But I think as Paul was working his way to death and he found out about the Galatian thing, that's why I suspect that Galatians was his Salavascala's last letter. He's pissed off, and it's like, my work is being undone. So as he's dying, he's still alive, barely. He's writing Galatians. He's very angry. He's writing it by himself. There's no co-authors helping him. The co-authors are out of the picture by this point. They're gone. They're not helping Paul anymore. They're out of the picture.
Gotcha.
And he's not mentioning that I'm gonna come down there and straighten y'all out. He never says that. That's because he's already retired. He's done. And he's just pissed. He can't do nothing about it. It's all going to hell in a handbasket as far as he's concerned. And so that's why I think it makes a better sense if Galatians came after 2 Timothy. It's already presupposing Paul's retirement. It's a kind of implying it.
Makes sense. Next question. Pseudo history. Do you really think the Romans would vest so much time and energy into writing the Gospels to aim plebiscite converts when they could just dictate law on what to believe? When
I'm looking for whenever I said, when the hell did I claim the Romans wrote the Gospels? I never said this.
I don't know you did. I'm just reading the question.
I have never believed that in my entire life. So I don't know where that's. I get you probably seriously misunderstood something I said. I don't know what that was.
Yeah, maybe, or maybe they don't. They weren't listening. Who knows? All right, so we'll get that off the screen. I actually do not see. Oh,
Daniel's put in some more super chats.
He did. Oh, there you go. There we go. Okay, here we go.
And thank you for those super chats, by the way, Daniel.
Daniel Kyle for $2. Was James perhaps the first Christian text?
No, I think the Epistle of James was written in response to Galatians by James in the 90s. That's my response. And Jim D specified that was not directed to Jacob. And who was it directed to? Because I don't understand at all what you were saying earlier, Ben, about Romans writing the Gospels. Who were you saying that about? But anyway, let me address Daniel's super chat while I wait on that. Can you break down which Paul's letters are each period? Oh, simple. 13 letters written about 96, 97 AD. The one letter we don't have by the original Paul is in the 30s. I think about probably 37 AD, maybe a little later, but I think 37 AD. Can't be any later at 39 because that's when the original Paul seemed to have died. Was killed by envious believers. Okay, I think I'm done addressing that. Oh, and the Marcion's edition's in the 140s. But anyway, I think I've addressed the super chat, Alan. Last one, Pastoral Letters compared by Irenaeus. I don't think I understand your question. What do you mean compared by Irenaeus? Forgive me, I don't understand this question. You'll have to clarify. You can take it off the screen, Alan, because I don't understand that question.
It's fine. Yeah, I don't either. Okay, I apologize for that, Daniel. But if you
Daniel said completed. He meant to say completed.
Pastoral Letters completed by Irenaeus.
No, I don't see any evidence Irenaeus wrote the pastoral epistles, if that's what this is suggesting. That doesn't make any sense to me. Not at all. I don't see how the pastorals could be realistically beyond Emperor Nerva. Composed by Slaviskala, the so-called Paul, the so-called individual that, the person claiming to be Paul in the 90s, working with the co-authors that I've mentioned before.
All right. Militis Christi. So are you saying the latter epistles are attributed, I'm guessing is what that means, to Paul?
No, he means a tribute or a tribute to Paul.
Okay.
Well, that doesn't make sense to me because, again, they were created in order to rehabilitate Paul, Catholicize Paul, universalize Paul. The original Paul was very divisive, not open to other people's viewpoints at all. Canonical Paul is like, we're all in Christ here. It doesn't matter what you believe. As long we're all in Christ, we're all in Christ. This is a point that's stressed in Canonical Paul many times. We are all in Christ. Now, he's not always consistent with that, by the way. He will deviate. Then again, he's got to integrate the beliefs of his co-authors that may not agree with his views either. And so no, it's not a tribute. It's fakery. It would be it's manipulation of the text. It's deliberate manipulation of the text to make Paul appear to be something that he wasn't. That's my answer to that question. We have another super chat from
Daniel corrects. He meant Ignatius.
Oh, so now Ignatius is the author of the pastorals? Still doesn't make any sense to me. No evidence of that. That's my only answer to that question.
Okay. And I think, let's see, we are going to end it on this question because I think it's the most important of the night. Does that make Paul SpongeBob SquarePants?
That's hilarious.
It is. And I
That's
appreciate the
hilarious.
lighthearted question. That is a fun way to end. So, everybody, thank you so much for joining, Jacob. I appreciate you being here. How
Thank
Paul
you,
was
Alan, for having
created.
me.
Wow, man, that was amazing. And of course, as always, I look forward to interacting with you further in the future. And we'll touch base again offline. And everybody who is in the chats and watching the show, if you wouldn't mind, I would love the support. Come on over to my channel and just subscribe. That would mean a lot to me. It would help me out a lot. Like whatever. I know you can watch from Jacob's channel, but if you wouldn't mind jumping over to mine, it is at the Unraveler AB. I'm popping it in the chat right now. You can just click the link at the Unraveler AB for AlanBondar. So that would be awesome if you wouldn't mind just jumping over and doing that. I'd really appreciate it.
Also, I have the Unraveler tagged underneath my end of the live stream for my audience to know.
Excellent. Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate you doing that. So everybody, we appreciate you joining us. Jacob, as always, again, great time. And for the rest of you, until next time, live free. Have a good night.